Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology and Around. My guest is Andrew Wilson, who is a teaching pastor at King's Church London and a columnist for Christianity Today. He has degrees in history and theology from Cambridge University and King's College in London. He's the author of several books, including this most recent one called Remaking the World: How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. And this forms the topic for our conversation together. And I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think you will too. So please welcome back to the show, the one and only Dr. Andrew Wilson. Was it in 2016 when I was in Eastbourne when we recorded, when you were on the podcast last, or have you been on since then? Do you remember?
Oh, no, I have been on the podcast. I think we spoke about spiritual gifts in the church, charismatic gifts. And we had a decent conversation about race and diversity in the church as well. But I don't know if that was the same conversation. Maybe we've spoken once or twice before.
So maybe once since then. But I think I've told this story before, but my first time coming across your work was in that, probably a lot of people say this, right? That debate you had with Rob Bell, 12 years ago. And it kind of, didn't go... viral might be a little too strong, but I feel like a lot of people saw that video.
Yeah, it's probably the thing I've done most people have seen. Yeah.
Okay. And I remember he was not on his game, and I was like, who's this Andrew Wilson guy? He's really sharp. And anyway, we've connected and been friends ever since. So your new book caught me by surprise. Remaking the World: How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. Now, I already have so many questions. One is, what's a biblical scholar doing writing on what I thought was American history? And then number two, I love the audacity of you writing on 1776, and then in the first few pages saying this book actually has very little to do with the founding of the United States. It's part of it, but it's not.
I'm an English guy.
So for the first question, have you? I know you have history as kind of part of your degrees, but I always think of you as just like a biblical scholar. Yeah. Where did you wanting to write on history come from?
So also primarily, I think of myself as a pastor. So which is not just an out. Like academically, I did a PhD in theology, but my undergrad degree was history and theology. But really, I come to it as a pastor and as a preacher in a way, thinking. I have to do cultural apologetics, or that's the language I would often use now to describe it all the time. And so I think I'm coming to this much more as I'm trying to understand the culture we're in. And I've found that history can be a really good way of introducing it to people. And it can be, I hope, a really compelling story to help people get their, categories which would sound a little bit dull if you said, well, we believe the following 7 things are all work at once. You tell people the story, it makes it more arresting, I hope. But for me, the genesis of this project was a collision really between two different things that I came across in my just wider reading, being interested. One was, I just didn't know that the steam engine was invented the day before The Wealth of Nations was written and or published, and that happened in the same year as the Declaration of Independence. No one had ever taught me any of those things. And so when I read those, there was one book I read, and I suddenly thought, oh, wow, this is a really significant year in terms of its economic and its industrial and its political ramifications. I'd like to learn more about that as a subject of interest. And that just began as a sort of, maybe one day I could write something explaining this story just for fun. But along the same time, I then read, I was coming across the work of John Haidt, who I know you've come across as well, and Joseph Henrich and others, about this sort of the way that the Western world is, the acronym WEIRD, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And I don't remember quite how it happened, but there was a moment where I put the two together. I think I was in the shower, and I just suddenly thought, hang on a second, I might be able to explain how our culture became like this using this acronym, drawing on this one year in which so many of these changes were sort of fermented and really took off. And then I've just found that that was an interesting story to tell, and I began to think it might work. And so I've very much done this as a sort of apologist, preacher, pastor person, rather than I'm not a historian by training, although I've read a bunch of history and theology, but that wasn't really what was motivating it. I think it's an attempt to say, this is why the culture you're in feels and thinks and behaves the way it does. And this is how a way of telling that story rooted in 1
Yeah.
year that hopefully, particularly America, will find interesting.
You make a great pastoral argument for why understanding history matters. For one, you have that cool quote, or that quote, that famous quote. I forget who it's by. You know, if you control the past, you control the future, or you control the
Yeah,
present.
yeah,
Who is
yeah.
that?
So
Do
this
you
is
remember?
Orwell's. Yeah, if the people who control the present control the past, but the
Right.
people who control the past control the future.
So that works. I mean, that on the flip side, if you understand the past, it helps you understand the present and future, and get your kind
Yeah.
of bearings about where we're at as a society. Um, I had no clue how many things happened in 1776. You go down this list of things in this 1 year alone. I
Yeah.
mean, things are unrelated, seemingly unrelated to each other, right?
Yeah. I
What are
think they
some
are.
other?
In many cases,
Yeah.
they are genuinely unrelated. So I think there's, so I mentioned, so the steam engine, the wealth of nations, Edward Gibbon's history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, all the events in America that obviously would be more well known to, I guess, most of your listeners, but those who aren't American, um, the Declaration of Independence, the Battle of Brooklyn, Washington's Crossing, Common Sense, Thomas Paine's book,
Mm,
and even things like the Virginia Declaration, which ends up sort of encoding things like religious liberty and freedom of the press. I mean, just so many things in the American scene. But in Europe, the Enlightenment is, it's high noon of the Enlightenment, really. It's a sort of dramatic period in the development of what we now think of as post-Christianity, or the move towards a secular public square. Immanuel Kant is drafting the Critique of Pure Reason. David Hume writes his dialogues and then dies. Captain Cook sailing around the world
mm,
and encountering all sorts of Polynesian peoples, which has massive implications for the history of the Pacific islands and subcontinents and so on. Um, and I mean, that's not even all of it. Romanticism, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Sturm und Drang in Germany. And I mean, it's just a remarkable year where you'd look at nearly every feature of modern life and say, well, in some way that is connected to events that took place in this year. And it's just a really great story, I think. Whether I
mm,
told it well is another matter, but as in the story as a whole is really compelling, because these things are, as you say, they're kind of independent. It's not like the American Revolution happens and suddenly people go, oh, we must write stories about the self. Like they are obviously connected at a looser level, but they aren't causally related, in part because news takes 3 months to travel from one side of
right.
the Atlantic to the other. And so these things are not all directly related to one another in sort of cause and effect. It's just there is something going on, and not just out in the world, actually in the church as well. The
Yeah.
Amazing Grace and the Olney hymns and Rock of Ages
Yeah.
and religious freedom and abolitionism in Britain, and so many moves like that are all happening at once. It's just a very exciting period.
But like you said early on in the book, this isn't come out of nowhere. Like there's various things leading up to it. What would you say are some of those things leading up to just 1776 being this cataclysmic upheaval of so many things going on, for good or for ill? I mean, obviously the printing press. I mean, a few hundred years before that,
Yeah.
1776 wouldn't have happened without the printing press. But what are some other things that were going on that kind of gave some of the momentum to some of these massive changes?
Yes, I mean, I think in some ways the Protestant Reformation would be, in not just as an event, but as a sort of a 50-year process
Mm,
in the 16th century for its impact in Northern Europe in particular. Obviously Britain. Well, it wasn't Britain at the time, but Britain and the Netherlands, and probably setting a slightly different path in terms what event effectively obviously fragments Christendom in the end, which I think is a significant part of the story,
mm,
but also a huge significant rise in literacy, which is then very significant in the exchange of knowledge, which is taking place at the time. I think it's also, in a way, does contribute to the competition between European nations for empires, and that was already starting, obviously, before the Reformation. And that's a big part of this story for good, but also much for ill, as we know. Um, I think probably the shape of something like abolitionism wouldn't have taken the form it did without that being a Protestant offshoot as well, at least in its incarnation in Britain. And I think that the developments in technology, which are really beginning to accelerate, are also, as I try and make this case in the book, they are connected to Protestantism as well in certain ways, and very much a product of English-speaking nations,
mm.
which is a fascinating story as to why that is. So I think there's a lot of things that probably have roots somewhere in that combination you mentioned between the printing press and Protestantism. And I think in many others, it's some of it's political changes beginning. Some of it's just a sort of almost accelerating of history, that you reach you begin to reach a tipping point where changes and innovations get baked in, rather than
Mm-hmm.
going along in a flurry of new developments and then running out of steam and cannibalizing themselves. It does seem that in the mid 18th century, maybe it's just the trajectory of society as a whole, but a lot of these developments begin to get baked in and reinforce one another, and one idea sparks another idea. And so,
Mm-hmm.
although, as I said, these things are not causally connected, someone like your own Benjamin Franklin is
Mm-hmm.
involved anecdotally or in a sort of very observy kind of way with many of these things. So he pops
Mm-hmm.
up in the cafes of the Enlightenment, and he's also friends with all of the lunar men developing industrial technology, and he's also a founding father, and he's also a diplomat in France. And so you could live, like David Hume did, a life where you're connected to a lot of these changes, and some of that is society's beginning to reach a level of education, literacy, and affluence that change begins to accelerate. And so
Yeah.
some of it is that, but a lot of it, I think, has to do with Protestantism as well.
Okay. You mentioned as one of these many significant events, Benjamin Franklin's diplomatic journey to France.
Yeah.
What was significant? I think you maybe go back to that later on in the book, which I haven't got to yet. What was significant about that specific?
I'm going to get myself in trouble. But basically, because the French won the war rather than the Americans. That's a harsh way of saying it. Its implication, that's a very overstated version. But I think that line in Hamilton, isn't it? You cheat with the French, now I'm fighting with France and with Spain. But obviously, I think that the contribution of the involvement of the French in the American-British War. So the superpowers in the world at the time are Britain and France, and originally England and France, and they'd been fighting for, well, I'd sometimes think 1,000 years in a way, from 1066 to present day, that you could trace the story. And we had a huge, which would be known as the French Indian War in America, but in much of the rest of the world it's just known as the 7 Years' War.
Mm-hmm.
And that conflict, which obviously then Ben Franklin goes to Paris and tries to get the French to join in, and effectively the French say, well, maybe, but then eventually battles start turning the Americans' way, and the French say, great, we'll pile in. But that has two huge implications, because it obviously means that the Americans in the end win. So Yorktown and all that is not least because the French Navy and the French army, but also it has cataclysmic impacts in France. So it's often said that Britain loses the war but wins the peace, and France is the other way around. So France wins the war against Britain, with America as almost like a proxy from a French perspective. But the result is they spend so much and are committed so much and end up in their conflict with Britain economically suffering so much that they become a bit of an economic mess in the 1780s, and that ends up leading to revolution. So the French Revolution is in some ways an unintended consequence, many ways, an unintended consequence of the French supporting the Americans in the war against Britain. So Britain obviously lose, but 30 years later, Britain is trading merrily with America and is actually roughly doing okay on a trade point of view. And the French have gone into revolution, and then that's turned into Thermidor and then eventually Napoleon. So its impact in Western Europe and North America is very large. That diplomatic connection that was made in 1776.
Oh, that's fascinating. I never you know more about my history than I do, certainly. But whenever I go to the UK, though, I feel like people in the UK know more about American history than a lot of Americans. It's so funny.
Well, that is not. I tell you what, when I say this book is about 76, most English people say, "What on earth happened then?" It's just not a number that is meaningful to them. So,
oh, really? Okay.
Well, you probably had a fairly unusual sample size if you studied a PhD at a British university. Maybe that they're more aware than the average Brit, I would think.
Well, I'm thinking maybe more contemporary, like definitely American politics. I feel like within seconds of talking to anybody in the UK, that they want to talk, when they find out I'm American, they want to talk about American politics. But that might just be because they know I'm American, so that's where they want to go as well. But what is it? Well, with the French Revolution, what are some? And I didn't prep you ahead of time, so I apologize if
no, I prefer conversations like this. It's great fun.
Oh, good. I do too. I rarely give questions ahead of time. So what since the American Revolution and the French Revolution were so close to each other, and like you just said, they weren't completely distinct, like they were related in many ways. What are some similarities and differences between the French Revolution and the American
Ooh,
Revolution? Have you thought
that's a
about
great.
that? Is that like something that's a
Yeah,
well-known kind of comparison?
and
Or?
I do actually I get into that a bit in the chapter on democracy,
Hmm.
because I think the puzzle for no one's an objective historian, but the puzzle for a neutral-ish historian is why didn't the surprise is the American Revolution? Why did the American Revolution survive? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
the French Revolution does what most revolutions do, which is, in a way, it collapses under its own weight.
Mm-hmm.
You end up, the Animal Farm phenomenon, to be honest, is in Orwell's terms, or the Russian Revolution, where we'll get rid of the big guys, but then we'll become the big guys, and then we'll get taken down, and eventually the whole thing implodes until a strong
Right.
man comes along and says, "Guys, we've got to pack it in," which is what Napoleon eventually does. So France is a slightly almost a paradigmatic example of what happens when revolutions run amok. The surprise in a way is why that doesn't happen in America. And I think the difference is because, in my framing of things anyway, the American Revolution has got two parents ideologically. And I think one is sort of British Whiggery. So people who are quite concerned about this, and the Glorious Revolution in England, and then sort of people who would say we must make sure that we preserve, we don't really mind monarchs, we think they're fine, we just don't like them taxing us too much without representation, but we want stability, we want a separation of powers, we want solid institutions, we definitely don't want the mob running the show.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got that impulse represented in the American Revolution by people like George Washington and John Adams and many others who would be familiar names. But in America, you've got that sort of Whiggish, we must make sure we have solid institutions, mingled with this sort of very zealous, idealistic, all people are created, all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with these supreme. And you've got this sort of very rhetorically bombastic, zealous, more French influence, the sort of radicalism, all human beings. Of course, they didn't live this way, most of them, but in theory, all human beings are equal. And that's not, in so many ways. So Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and George Washington are concerned by different problems. They've got different objections to what might be happening in the revolution than Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, because they're almost looking at opposite problems. And so you're sort of your Whig guys, who much form the Federalist group, are in the end are effectively saying we're concerned that the mob might take over, but whereas the people who become the Democratic Republicans, the sort of Jefferson Paine tranche of the movement, are saying we're concerned that not the mob won't have, almost the people won't have enough power, and we're going to still be run by a monarch. John Adams seems to want George Washington to be called Your Majesty. All that they're terrified of is almost too much like the British model. And so effectively you have a British thread and a French thread, which in the American Revolution come together, and the American Revolution just survived. Like in the 1790s, I think you could say it very nearly didn't. It descended into such acrimony, mudslinging. It could very easily have imploded, but it didn't. Somehow it survived. And I think, some of this is a lot of the book is tracing deep historical causes and saying people don't really make the difference we think. But on occasion, and in this one, I really think a handful of remarkable individuals really did do things and say things that meant a nation was able to cohere in spite of those tensions. And George Washington, I do think, is one of those, just a remarkable person. And had he not handed over power the way he did, America probably would have fragmented and imploded in a different way like France did. But it's really the tension between, say, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, or John Adams and Thomas Paine, that sort of those two perspectives that came together that meant America was radical enough to be compelling, but it was also conservative enough to survive. And it still is. And that gets fought out every election, which is probably why your friends want to talk to you about American politics all the time, because there's more at stake in those debates than there are in Britain or even France.
Did I tell you the time when my first summer in Aberdeen, Scotland, and my little family, my wife and my one kid at that time, and some American friends were getting together for a Fourth of July celebration, and I remember inviting one of my newly minted British friends to the party, and he's like, "Yeah, we usually don't celebrate the times when one of our colonies broke off from us." This is how jaded Americans can be, though. Like, I literally, here I am, somehow got accepted into a PhD program. I'm in my late 20s, already fairly well educated, and it didn't really dawn on me. I was like, oh yeah, haven't thought about it like that before. Like, never had this broader picture of what the founding of the establishment of however you want to word it. There's so many politically incorrect ways of putting it, but the time when these British colonies broke off from the mothership. But do you talk about the question of whether the whole, like, America was founded as a Christian nation? That's become, I think, it's always kind of a talked about thing here. It's a matter of debate, and especially with whether it's a rise in Christian nationalism, or at least Christian nationalism is becoming a topic that's more talked about. I feel like the whole was America ever a Christian nation, that's come up more and more. From a historical standpoint, what is the answer to that question? What was America founded as a Christian nation?
That's great. It's just the English guy to throw him under the bus. Yeah, I have this. You probably haven't got to this bit yet, but I talk a bit I make quite a lot of the story in which the Declaration of Independence is edited. Have you come across this bit yet? Where Ben Franklin, Jefferson sends him a draft of the Declaration in late June.
You mentioned it. You mentioned it early on, but yeah, I haven't.
Yeah, so Jefferson sends Franklin a draft and says, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," and Franklin crosses it out and writes "self-evident." And I use it as a metaphor, really, for the post-Christian West, which is we take things that ultimately are Christian sacred truths and then say these are now just obvious to everybody, so we can put them down to results of reason. And see that's in some ways quite a good, I hope the beginnings of a good answer to that question. So to what extent is it a Christian nation? I think it's very much a Christian nation if what you mean is it is founded on a logic and an anthropology and a belief in the orderedness of history and rights, which could never have emerged outside of a Christian milieu. That's definitely true, but in that sense, Britain is a Christian nation, and so is France, and so is Spain, and so it's pretty much anywhere that descends from Christendom. But I think usually people in your country in the debate today mean more than that it is a Christian nation. I mean, there's something in the founding charter that doesn't hold up if the nation is not confessionally Christian, or there is not or majority Christian. And in that sense, I don't think it is. And what I slightly facetiously do towards the end of that chapter is I say that in many ways, I talk about Protestant paganism. I say that I think the post-Christian world is a fusion of Protestantism and paganism. And that's my explanation of why the world is post-Christian to the extent that it is. And I say in many ways, the best statement of Protestant paganism out there is the Declaration of Independence, because it is a fusion of sectarian Protestants and Unitarians, deists, and the like. And it's a collision between the two that you end up with both statements even in the opening paragraph, which are inconceivable without a Christian view of providence and anthropology and even theology, endowed by our creator. Most people in human history haven't believed in one creator anyway. So that's a very Christian statement. And yet the focus and the trajectory of the document takes Christian principles and kind of universalizes and somewhat secularizes them through the influence of people like Franklin and Jefferson and other varying degree deistic thinkers. And as a result, becomes much more pagan. I don't mean pagan in a pejorative sense. I mean almost in a technical sense, like people who believe that the sacred is located within the world, not beyond it. And I think the Declaration is a great example of that phenomenon. I show how it's also true in Gibbon and Hume and many other thinkers at the time, Voltaire. But in the context of the Declaration, I think so. I think in that sense, America is simultaneously Protestant and pagan, which is what so surprised Tocqueville when he visited later, saying, well, these guys are always going on about how much they love God, but it's hard to imagine a society in which people are more devoted to the present pursuit of pleasure than Americans. So what's the story there? They seem so religious, yet they seem, in my terms, very pagan as well. And I think, that's the collision that is represented in many ways, even within the Declaration itself.
That makes a lot of sense. So, like, I don't know if Jamie Smith and others have talked about the craters of the gospel that have been left on many Western nations, to where the impact of a Christian worldview has become embedded in just societal assumptions, the goods of liberal democracy and religious freedom and these kind of things. Like, maybe, I don't know if religious freedom would be the right one, but like there's an impact, the imprint of that the gospel has had on society. But that's different than saying it's a Christian nation in the sense that here's a bunch of zealous, sold out Christ followers trying to establish a nation under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Rather,
Yeah,
it's saying that Christianity has had such an impact on society that people take for granted certain
yeah.
aspects of a Christian worldview as just self-evident. That's interesting. So he was editing it away from, he was trying to tweak the language so it was less religious and more secular, for lack of
Yeah,
a better term.
yeah. So I mean, yeah, that would, I expect Franklin would probably see that as a slightly anachronistic. And I think he's trying to.
Yeah.
He would see himself as trying to universalize something. He's saying this does not require
Okay.
sacred convictions to be able to ground. It's itself. It goes. He would say it's grounded in reason, not religion. Probably, rather than saying,
Got
I
it.
don't
Yeah.
think he would see himself as secularizing, but he's probably more just universalizing. But I think the point is that you can only say that this is self-evident because of Christian assumptions about human beings and creation. The whole paragraph drips with explicitly Judeo-Christian assumptions about human beings and creation
Mhm.
and providence and so on. And it's only self-evident. That's the funny thing, is obviously wasn't self-evident. Like, the reason they had to write this thing down was because a lot of people didn't believe it, and several of the founding fathers themselves hadn't believed it 10 years earlier. And most people in the world today still don't believe that it is a God-given right for you to overthrow the government you want and replace them with someone else if they're charging you too many taxes. Or it's not. It clearly is not self-evident. Like, and that's why they say we hold these truths to be self-evident, as in we believe they are. But of course, Jefferson originally written they're sacred. And if you trace the prehistory, as I do in that chapter, you can see that
Uh,
Jefferson's getting his language from John Locke, which many people know as they read John Locke. But you then go to Locke and look up where he got it, and he got it from Richard Hooker. And then you go to Richard Hooker and see that he was basically taking it straight out of Matthew's Gospel and the Code of Justinian. Like, so even that famous paragraph has a genealogy that is very explicitly Christian and couldn't be said in even an Islamic context, let alone in a Confucian or an atheist or an animist context. It's a very Christian influenced statement that couldn't really have been made anywhere outside of a sort of Christendom, a country that was leaving Christendom at the time.
that makes a lot of sense, actually. I mean, to use two more anachronistic categories, they were trying to push it more towards like general revelation rather than special revelation, rather than making
Yes,
this a
yeah.
distinctly Christian thing, saying this is, yeah, universalizing it. Can you, so, how can they, in 1776, how could you write something like all men are created equal while slavery was still, while owning, some of the founding
Yeah,
fathers, right, were slave owners? Like,
hundreds of slaves. Yeah,
do you get into that, or what? Like, how could you write that? And
I
what
don't.
was it? Was
To be
this
honest,
what
I
we're
don't.
aspiring to do? Was there kind of an anti-slavery sentiment that was in existence? There was a flickering light at that time, or like what?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you need to get Tommy Kidd on to talk about this, really, because he's so good on it, and it's
Uh,
just fast on Jefferson specifically, who is probably the most interesting example. I think that lots of the founding fathers are varying degrees of hypocritical on this issue, but Jefferson is the most interesting, I think, because obviously he wrote the famous words, and yet was just such an example of someone who didn't live them out. And even by the end of his, even as he's near death, best part of 50 years later. Of course, he does die 50 years later. Is still saying this is not how the world has been made, but he still doesn't emancipate the slaves. So
hmm.
he lives with that conflict, and he's a complicated man. And I think many of them lived with almost an awareness of an inconsistency, which is this is something that should not be. It is. If we raise it too much now, we will split this nation. All the kind of defenses that people usually make of the founding fathers have truth to them, but obviously they don't excuse it either in the slightest. And I think usually reflect just a fundamental moral inconsistency that, in some ways, when I read it, I think, oh wow, what am I? Do I have inconsistencies like that in my own thought? They're things which I profess to believe that I actually don't because of the way I've lived them out. And I think sometimes it's just as simple as this would have been enormously complicated and expensive for me. Or it would have been, and I think sometimes a more high-minded version would be, America is a beautiful idea and we'll lose it if we push this point too hard. But in the end, what they're really saying is, yeah, the equality of Black Americans is not as important to me as the unity of white Americans. And that must be what they, in somewhere in them, there must be some triage taking place like that between different goods. So I don't attempt to excuse it at all. Obviously, it's not my.
Yeah.
I don't have a dog in that fight in the slightest. And I think as I'm reading them, thinking, wow, how on earth could you guys not see this? But you kind of have to at least attempt to understand how
Sure.
people saw the world themselves. But yeah, you should interview Tom Kidd, because he's really interesting on this whole thing, and he's a fascinating take on religion and the founding fathers. He knows far more about it than I do. But that's the best I've got at the moment. I think they just lived with an inconsistency that they did genuinely believe two irreconcilable things, and believed one of them more strongly than the other, and therefore lived accordingly.
So when they wrote those words, you're saying again, we can't climb inside their minds or hearts, but they probably recognized the tension. It wasn't like they were just oblivious to writing something that was just directly being, not
I
lived
think some of
out.
them did. I think
Okay.
some of them did. So I think you do have some of them who obviously are. I don't mean Jefferson, um, but I think you actually have a spectrum. You have people who are already becoming quite emphatically pro-slave, saying, "I'm going to defend this as a moral good." That most of
Mhm.
that doesn't kick in for another 30 or 40 years, and that's for economic reasons, really. Um, but in
Okay.
the 1770s, you have people who would say this. You might have a few people who say this is a good. You have some people who say, no, it's not really, but actually we can just live with it. And particularly in the South, this is just the way our economy works. Then you have people who say, this is a problem and we need to change it, but for now, we need to compromise in order to hold the nation together, which is more like where you end up with sort of Hamilton, Adams. And then you get people who are more full on abolitionists, which obviously a lot of leading African Americans are. And I talk a lot in the book about Lemuel Haynes, who's the first, sort of African American preacher who comes out on this. And he literally writes almost immediately after the Declaration, using the
Huh.
Declaration's language. Here you go. This is an argument for abolitionism. But you do have, and particularly in Britain, you have a lot of people slamming the Americans for their revolution, saying, how are you talking about freedom? And here you go, own slaves. What on earth are you doing? Like Samuel Johnson, all these guys. So you have plenty of people saying that as well. But I think most of the founding fathers are in the middle two camps, and there's plenty of conflict between them, obviously, over
I
the
wonder if
issue.
I wonder if it'd be similar to, and this is to make I don't like making this isn't a one-to-one analogy, obviously, but like when preachers might stand up and preach against luxury and comfort and our addiction to material things. And it's like you transport anybody from like, a non-Western country or a place where, poverty is pretty rampant, and put them in an American church, and they're looking around saying, wait, you guys are saying this, but you're not
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
you have a
yeah,
long way to go before you're coming close to living out. And even if you ask me, I'm like, yeah, what do you do? Like I drive a car, and I live in a house with air conditioning and heat. And like, if I want food, I just go to the refrigerator and get it. If I don't want food in my refrigerator, I go down to the store and buy it. Like,
yeah,
we're just sort of swimming in
yeah.
luxury and comfort. And yet
I
I would
do
be the
think
first one to say like, this kind of, this isn't good for my faith. This goes against kind of, several streams of
yeah.
scriptural thought, so I don't know, maybe it's something like that, where
I think
at least with
you have
some.
to allow it yourself to be challenged by the same question, don't you? I do
Mhm.
think it's still different, though, in that I think most pastors who preach against greed, mm, you would think they may be being greedy, but
Mhm.
they probably don't believe they are. Whereas I don't think Jefferson didn't think he owned slaves, if you see what I mean. Like
Right.
there is,
Okay.
so I think there is a difference
Hmm.
where this isn't so much. Would be like me saying we mustn't be greedy, and I am being greedy, and I still think that's morally acceptable, which I don't think is maybe a thing, but I don't think that's common now. Whereas I
Hmm.
think what Jefferson's doing is more odd and requires more sort of digging into how did a person get there, because he is genuinely saying this ought not to be the case, and I still do it. Um, and not just Jefferson, obviously, many others as well. But as I say, I think there'd be many who, this is such a huge question in the literature, many who've read and know far more about it than me. So I wouldn't want to
Yeah.
deviate too far. But that's I think you're right, though, that you have to apply, when you ask that question to someone else, you have to go, where is the equivalent of that now? And you're right. I think material possessions are probably the most obvious place to look.
I think it was Robert George. Oh, I'm gonna butcher this. I think I heard it about Robert
I
George,
think
the
I know what you're going to
professor.
say. Is this the thread about you would have opposed slavery? Oh no, you
Yes.
wouldn't. Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that
it's brilliant, isn't it?
Princeton professor? And he, how
Yeah,
he asked his class, how many of you would have opposed slavery 200 years ago? And everybody raised their hand, right? Like, of course I would. And then his next question is, so what are you doing now that that basically gets you ostracized from your own social tribe? Like, what injustices are you, not against the other side about those people out there, about Republicans or whatever, but like, how are you being ostracized from your own tribal allegiances by pointing stuff out? And everybody's like, "Oh, I'm not." not tweeting about that, you
know. Yeah.
Um,
It's really, and that of course is the difference between our two nations on the response, in the sense that Britain moves to abolitionism quicker, partly because you just got less of an economic stake in it by that point.
okay.
And so it's not because British people are more moral or more able to see what the Bible teaches. It's because what's that lovely line from Upton Sinclair? It's very hard to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on him not understanding it. And I think that's a big factor on both sides of the Atlantic in this one.
That is one of my favorite quotes in the history of humanity. It's so good.
It's so good.
What about, like, I mean, you have Jonathan Edwards, you have Christian leaders who, it's one thing for somebody who's like part of this economics, they're at the political level or whatever, they're having to navigate many things. What do you do with, and I don't know, maybe we don't need to go if you're like, this isn't my main.
No, I have to wuss out a bit on Edwards. I mean, I have exactly the same question. How on earth did they think that? But I don't know any more about Jonathan Edwards than the next man, really, because he's about, died about 20 or 30 years before I start. I mentioned him in passing because of his relationship to Aaron Burr, but I don't. And lots of people who know a lot have gone deep into Edwards and gone, this is reprehensible. This is how he got there. I think he maybe did it this way, maybe did it that way, maybe did it the other, but I just haven't read enough of it to speak with any useful knowledge on that, really.
This episode is sponsored by the Pour Over Podcast. Oh my word, I love the Pour Over Podcast. It is a trustworthy news resource guiding people toward eternal hope. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not conservative, it's not liberal. Instead, it is a Christ-centered summary of the major events going on in politics and in culture. Like most of you, I am so tired of news outlets that are so clearly biased toward the right or to the left. I want to stay informed with what's going on, but I hate how traditional news outlets shape my heart and try to win me to a certain side. I mean, if you don't believe me, just ask yourself this question. After listening to, say, I don't know, CNN or Fox News for like 30 minutes, am I less or more motivated to love my neighbor and my enemy? If the answer is less, then Houston, we have a huge problem, a discipleship problem. This is why I'm so excited about the Pour Over Podcast. Each episode is only about 7 minutes long, and they just tell you about what's going on in the world. They don't tell you how to interpret the various events or how you should feel about what's going on. Instead, they just let you know about the facts of what's going on while reminding listeners that our ultimate identity and hope is in Jesus Christ. I've even met some of the people at the Pour Over, and they are super awesome. They're not some like closeted liberal or closeted conservative think tank. They're truly, genuinely just trying to keep us informed while staying focused on Christ. So don't let traditional media outlets steal your affection away from loving people who might vote differently than you. Instead, check out and subscribe to the Pour Over Podcast in your favorite podcast app. Hello, friends. I want to let you know about a couple of events that I'm hosting on the LGBTQ conversation in Santa Clarita and then again in San Diego in California. The Santa Clarita event is October 16th and 17th, and the San Diego event is October 19th and 20th. These are two different events. One is an evening conversation where we sort of introduce the LGBTQ conversation, and then the following day in both cities, we do a full day training for church leaders, again, on the LGBTQ conversation. We dig into theology, relationships, pastoral ministry questions. We hear testimonies from various people. It's a time when we can come together and think deeply, love widely, dig into both truth and grace in what has become some of the most pressing questions facing the church today. To find out more about these two events, you can go to centerforfaith.com. Go to the events link and you can find all the info there. Again, October 16th to the 17th in Santa Clarita, and then the 19th and 20th in San Diego. If you cannot make it out to California, or if you don't live anywhere near these cities, you can also stream these events live online. Again, centerforfaith.com. Different question here. This will tap into your expertise as a biblical scholar. Was the American Revolution, in your opinion, a violation of Romans 13?
My goodness, this is in a book that's not mostly about America. It's like, let's just talk about American politics and see how much trouble can we cause you in the space.
Have to.
Well, so you and I you and I have, in fact, we might have bonded over our pacifism or non-violence before anything else.
Yeah.
I don't remember, actually. I think we spoke about that way back when your book Fight came out. And so I think an awful lot of things are violations of biblical teaching on, violence, resistance, and so on, that many other Christians wouldn't. So I think I would say it was, but I would say so were the British, and so was the French Revolution, and so were an awful lot of things, in part because of the way that they take up arms and use them.
Like any kind of violent revolution would be a violation of exactly what Paul's,
and probably you would, but an awful lot of, I think, perhaps a harder version of the same question is, yes, but let's say you didn't hold to assumptions about pacifism and non-violence that you do. Would you still think it was wrong, even under the just war defense? And if I'm honest, I just haven't really thought about that, because it's a bit of a hypothetical. I've just never, partly it's 250 years ago, but partly it also predicates something that I don't believe, and then says, what would you think if you did? So what do you think?
I don't even think you need to be committed to nonviolence, really. I mean, because, what are you going to say? Like, yeah, but, the British Empire was really oppressive at this time. Like, Paul's writing under Rome, under Nero. Okay. So we're not talking about some like lesser, evil of an empire or something. And then you're like, yeah, but, the taxes were really oppressive and it was unjust. It's like, Paul talks about taxes in the same. He goes right into paying taxes. Again, taxation under the Roman regime was without doing a thorough comparison of the two, I'm gonna guess is probably way more oppressive and unjust and funding all kinds of stuff. So I don't know what argument, like, if Paul can write what he did in Romans 13, which I think, well, yeah, I mean, there's different thoughts of kind of what his main point was there. But it seems to be clearly against, at the very least, some kind of violent overthrow, kind of a violent overthrow of oppressive regimes ruling over you, because ultimately God's in control and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think, I don't know. I haven't seen people make a good argument on the contrary that no, like in this case, Romans 13 would not really apply.
No, you can probably make the argument that the British are a lot worse. Which is, I imagine, where a lot of Americans would go with it, and no doubt it's true. Because I think Romans 13, for me at least, Romans 13 would condemn both sides, as would a number of other, biblical passages. But but it's obviously I don't really have a reason to try and defend that position from that critique. But
I guess I would be more concerned somebody that would be so reluctant to say it was a violation. Like, why? What are we trying to? Yeah. They violated Genesis 1:27 that all people are created equal, like with slavery. I mean, I don't know why we would even feel the need to kind of like whitewash our history. Like, to me, the desire to want to whitewash it is like, what are the deeper things going on here? Like, do we feel a need to have a more sanitized version of American history, or a more Christianized version? Like, let's talk about that. Like, to me, that would be the greater problem.
Yeah, and similarly with the expropriation of land from Native Americans, which is, so you've got those three, haven't you? Well, you've got three actors, three people with whom the early American state is in dialogue or conflicts, right? You have African Americans, you have Native Americans, you have the Brits, and then indirectly the French. And in all three cases, I just think in some ways the case for did you get it wrong with the Brits is probably the weakest of the three. As in, you can clearly say, well, morally that's totally unacceptable with the first two, but maybe with all three. But then, of course, it sounds like, I'll get an English guy on a podcast and he'll say the American state is foundationally illegitimate and should never have started, which is, I'm still hoping to be welcomed through the border next time I come. But
Well, let's get off our American high horses here. Let's go back to the acronym WEIRD, and you use weirder. I think is a more, because you want to. What are the other two? What's E and R?
Ex-Christian and romantic.
Ex-Christian and romantic. Can you go through all? I guess 7. Is it 7? Can you go through all of them again, and then maybe pick out one or two that you think are that you would want to talk about? Something that's really significant, maybe something that we haven't really thought about.
Great. So W stands for Western, which I guess is the trend of globalization. At least that's what's going on in 1776. E stands for educated, which I tell the story of the Enlightenment. I stands for industrialization or industrialized, which is the Industrial Revolution. R stands for rich, which basically, if you look at a sort of chart of GDP, world GDP over human history, you'll notice it just runs along a flat line and then turns a corner of the hockey stick in the mid 1770s and shoots up and hasn't stopped increasing since. So that's a very important development. Then the D stands for democracy, which is obviously the American Revolution we've been talking about. Then the next E stands for ex-Christian, and then finally romantic, which refer to the journeys of beginning to leave Christianity behind, as we've touched on, and then the romantic movement, and so on, which doesn't really begin in earnest until the 1790s, but all of its seeds are there in the 1770s, I think.
And your main point, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's hard to understand the way we think, the things we take for granted, the things we assume are goods in society like democracy. It's impossible to really unpack who we are today without understanding these kind of 7 major shifts. Like, these weren't a thing prior to 1776.
No, they were some of them are closer to the surface than others, but absolutely. And I think particularly you can group them into 2. There are, so several of those developments are primarily things to do with matter, geography, like where, ships, inventions, land, minerals, maps, in some cases, literally how a continent is wide versus tall, or where navigable rivers are, all those sorts of things. And actually a bunch of what makes Western or weirder people, the kind of people that they and we are, is what looks like quite material contingencies. Under the providence of God, you'd say, obviously, God's in charge of it all, but you would say these things look like they're quite deep historical factors, and they're to do with things that have the advantages, or whatever you call them, that have existed for Western people, that are based on where coal is and where iron is and where the rivers are and what crops grow where and what animals are native to which country. And so you have a number of those factors which relate to industrialization, technology, globalization, and enrichment. And then you have a group of other factors in a separate group, which are to do with the realm of ideas and the things that people think. So, it's maps and chaps, right? Or so what's where matter, and then what ideas, what are people thinking, saying, writing? And one of the things I want to do in the book is to try and tell a story of the West, and also really of apologetics of the church, of how we engage with the world we're in, that gives due credit to both of those types of cause. So I think there are not many in my circles, but there's plenty of more Marxist-leaning historians who would say this is almost all a result of deep causes, that the individuals who gets elected, who writes which book, that's not really the issue. What really matters is pretty deep. It's deep down in the ocean that are pulling a culture one way or another, and ideas are not that interesting. And then you have, obviously, in our circles, I expect most people you and I would talk to on podcasts or shows would be much, much more interested in ideas than in things like minerals and money and those sorts of things. But I think in apologetics and in just Christian thought, evangelicals certainly are inclined to place much, much more emphasis, dramatically more emphasis on the ideas, on who said what when, and who wrote what, and how influential it was, and how well written it was, and who it then influenced. And in this book, I'm trying to bring together both of those causes. So several of the chapters are literally about inventions, and about some of them to the point of being about maps and coasts and mountains, and to try and tell the story about how the West came to be what it is, mingled with the ideas, which are also incredibly important. And so Romanticism, the Enlightenment, and leaving Christianity behind, or trying to, and not succeeding, are very ideological. And they, of course, feed into each other. And they're both, they affect one another and are shaped by each other. But I think that's a really interesting, I would say that, but I think that's a really interesting story. So those are probably the 2 main groups of causes that I'm trying to bring together. And you can see them playing, you can see them playing together even in things like, why did the Industrial Revolution happen when it did, and where it did? And you say, well, some of that is to do with very boring arguments about what's on the map, and some of it is to do with ideas like Protestantism or literacy or experimentation, novelty, which might be grounded in Christianity, and the combination of the 2 is what made the world such that you and I are able to be 5,000 miles away right now having a chat. Like it comes from both material and ideal causes.
Let's I guess we should shift gears, because your ultimate goal, like you said, I love it, is you're writing as a pastor, helping Christians understand where they're situated in society, and again, these kind of assumptions that we take for granted. What are some what would be some goals you would want or what are some successes you would want to see somebody who reads this book and walks away as a pastor? Like, what do you want this book and the ideas in here to do in people's hearts and minds for those who read it?
That's really good. So this morning, the senior pastor who I work with on our team here in our church came. He was just talking to the staff about it because he'd read it on his holiday and he's been very kind and commending it. But so I think what he said really, which was that I think in reading it, he said I was regularly seeing connections between things in the world today that make sense of why people think and do and say the things that they think, do and say, and how as Christians we can serve and love people better if we understand those things. But also in the book, I want to point towards some ways in which the church, even at the time these changes are taking place, were responding to the issues in the world around them and how we can learn from them. So I think I want to explain, to give people just a sense of context, a sense of sometimes even like people get a degree of power over something when they feel like they can name it or articulate it. I don't mean like therefore it's no longer a problem for them, but often people are very in the last 10, 15 years been very confused at the speed of change, and sometimes being able to say, look, here are some things that have been going on for 200 years that are why that is happening now, rather than gosh, this has just come out of nowhere. It's people often get frightened and don't react well, and they become more tribal when they think this is just yet another complete shock out of nowhere. And I think it can help people to see a longer story, to make sense of what's going on, and to serve their friends and neighbors who are obviously living in that world too, who don't believe in Jesus, and to help them make sense of it as well. So that's one aim, is just to sort of explain so that people can go, I see it. I've got some degree of agency now because I can understand this story and it doesn't shock me all the time. The other thing I wanted to do was to, as I say, to draw on what the church did at the time and say, I think there are some lessons here. So I pick out particularly the issues of grace, or the Christian response of grace, freedom, and truth, and talk about people, that the hymn writers at the time, and how suddenly and how dramatically they begin to describe the personal experience of grace, and say how in a weirder world, in a post-Christian world, grace becomes even more important to show people, because so much of the world is powered by works in a way that it wouldn't be perhaps in a agrarian pre-industrial society. So grace almost goes up strangely in its importance in a post-industrial, post-Christian kind of world for all sorts of reasons. I talk about freedom and the response of abolitionism, but also religious freedom, and talk about how both of those things should color our vision of freedom today, and how obviously that affects clearly an issue like race, or even fighting modern day slavery, but also how we understand freedom in a holistic way, such that it's not just freedom from oppression outside, but freedom from within as well, freedom from sin, freedom from our own fleshly desires. And then talk about truth through the work of probably my favorite person I met while writing the book is Johann Georg Hamann. He's a German philosopher nearly nobody has heard of, who's just one of the most brilliant minds ever. And this very unknown Christian Lutheran guy who just, savages brilliantly Cant and many other, but he's just a sort of genius thinker, but basically manages to take the Enlightenment on its own grounds and say, actually pursuing even truth is incredibly important for us as well. So I have some guidelines, some ways in which I think the church then can help the church now live in the weirder world. So those are probably my two goals. Yeah, explain the world and then help people think about how Christians should respond to it.
Well, you mentioned early on how the last several years, we can even say maybe a decade or 8 to 10 years, have seemed extra cataclysmic and disorienting, and people feel maybe an extra amount of fear, of anxiety. Do you come back to? I'm curious if you come back to that in the book, or is in the back of your mind? Are you trying to help people navigate really? Obviously, people who are reading the book, they live now, but I mean, there is kind of seemingly a unique kind of cultural moment we're in. Would it help to understand kind of last 200 years, 1776, to even understand some of the unique changes and shifts and seemingly cataclysmic things going on today?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of what's happening in the central bit of the book where I go through those 7 developments is an attempt to answer that question, which is really, how do we get here, and how are the different changes that we're experiencing, some of which we like and some of which we don't, connected to and symbiotic with each other? So what we want to do is say, well, I really like the increase in living standards, I like the increase in technological availability, I like the connectedness of the world, but I don't like Christianity being pushed to the margins, I don't like increasing secularization of the public square, I don't like what the idealization of the self, or even the sexual revolution and its current consequences, all that sort of stuff. And in a way, in telling the story the way I have, I'm trying to say, look, those things are connected in these ways. And actually, some of the things that we think of as just being a result of bad ideas are themselves a result of industrial technology, and that's for good and evil. And some of it's meant we eat better and live healthier and are less likely to die in childbirth and all that sort of stuff. But it also means that our communities are likely to be hollowed out, and people are less likely to go to church, and people are more likely to idealize the self and more likely to make selfish political, sexual, material choices. And those things are actually byproducts of the same kind of development. So when you see a sudden rush of social change, as we did between, say, 2014 and 2017, and the consequences of which are still being felt now, it doesn't make those things go away, but it puts them in a context of a story that go, okay, so this development is actually bound up with something I really like. It's not just that's a bad thing. I mean, it's also a product of something that's also produced some good things. And being able to read the story that way, I hope, helps people not kind of panic or overreact, at the same time as not being naive about how dangerous it can be. We just say we are in part also complicit in some of these things, and that some of the choices I make, that I, for good reasons, are connected to consequences or factors that might actually make Christianity harder for people, including myself. Smartphones are an obvious example. This kind of technology is one. Like, I generally think the goods outweigh the bads, but some of it's bad in some of what it diminishes. It means I spend more time with some American friends like you than I do with some people in my own street, and that's not probably a good thing for human flourishing overall. But I still do it, and I still think it's probably the goods outweigh the bads. And it's that kind of thing writ large with developments in society as a whole that I'm trying to do. So I hope I do answer that question in the book in quite a lot of detail, but the reader will tell me if I have.
So I mean, would you say encouraging us to be a little more self-reflected, kind of like going back to the whole slavery / all people are created equal, the Declaration of Independence? Like we wish they would have been a little more self-reflected, and it's easy on this side, hindsight's 2020, and it's easy on this side of history to be, very judgy on things in the past, as if going back again, would we have done anything different if we were actually living in that situation? So I can sense, even from the little I've already read, that it's, as I'm reading, it's encouraging me to be more self-reflective of how are people in 200 years writing our history going to point out these major, like, how did you not see this kind of thing,
well, I think when you read about the past in any detail of any sort, you've got to have some encounter like that, because it's, it's that famous line, the past is a different country, another country, they do things differently there. It's, you read it and go, wow, it's like traveling. You just go, wow, these things that I take as self-evident are not. They're very different in different cultures. But I think I'm quite an optimistic, upbeat kind of person, as you are, I guess. And I actually want to see that some of the things that are, I want to kind of push back a little bit against this development snuck in and poisoned the well and made everything bad. Because I think I want to say that a lot of the things that are responsible, and they are responsible for things that make Christianity harder today, are themselves products of Christian impact and influence in years and generations past. And so Peter Berger said famously, Christianity historically has been its own gravedigger. Or I use the language of being hoisted by our own petard. So Protestantism is a good example, that it introduces things into a culture that in the end make it harder to be a Christian. Christianity itself does that. It ends up spreading through the empire. It ends up converting the empire, which then ends up doing all sorts of things that in the end will make Christianity more difficult. Christianity makes, in the long run, I've been persuaded of this, leads to developments that make societies more affluent, But in the end, that affluence makes families smaller and makes people more privatized, and in the end makes people go to church less, which in the end leads to lower religious observance. And so in a way, Christianity produces things that then make Christianity harder. And that to therefore say this is not only boo hiss to these guys and yay yay to these guys, but to say some of these morally complicated things that we are wrestling with now and seeing the fruit of in current social life have grown out of things that would not be where they are without Christianity. And that's not to say that we should therefore say, oh, no problem then. It just means that the way we respond to them and engage with them in the public square or with friends and neighbors needs to be a bit more subtle than this is just a bad thing that came out. So
how do you I've never thought about it like that. How do you process that? How do you make sense of that Christian values, Christian principles lead to a certain level of flourishing in society that ends up kind of hurting us in the long run? Like what? That's, I mean, I've never thought of it like that, but I mean, it just as my mind goes various places, it's like, yeah, we became, you think about this, the massive growth of the massive growth of the early church, largely because it valued women. It kind of attacked classism to some extent. It had this like really radical economic, and so people were really attracted to that. And so many people more and more were attracted to it, till you get to the, the turn of the 300s or whatever, when Constantine's looking out saying, oh my gosh, it would politically be very expedient if I was a little more, chummy with these Christians, because they're kind of taking over the empire. And then that leads to so many things in a post-Constantinian world that ended up not helping the church. I mean, just like you said. So I don't know how to make sense of that. So the positive impact that Christianity can have on society can often lead to negative impacts on society. Is that a right way of processing?
Yeah, I think so. So you're the one you've mentioned is, and obviously I mentioned as well, is I think a really good example of that. But more recently, I think you would say, so if we take this period, the role of Christianity in industrialization and in economic growth, I think there's a very clear link there in all sorts of ways, which I try and trace in several chapters in the book. But that in the end, that has made communities fragment and individuals more retreat into their nuclear families, and then finally as individuals, which has made church attendance go down, which has made it harder to pass on Christianity and to evangelize. So that, and then even if you look even in today, in the sort of in your field, sexual ethics, you think actually most of the impulses to try and push hard against Christian sexual ethics in our culture originate in Christian impulses somewhere. As in, we are trying to disaggregate with homosexuality. We're trying to disaggregate people's what people want to do, people's temptations or people's desires from their natures. Or we are with trans. We're trying to make sure that we protect the most vulnerable people, and these people are very vulnerable and marginalized people, so we want to make sure we make life. That's a Christian impulse, which is just become, I mean, one of the epigraphs to my book is when Chesterton says the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. But what happens is that's a Christian impulse that when untethered from other Christian impulses leads to social changes that most Christians now find very difficult. But they've grown out of Christian assumptions about human beings and the care for the weak and the poor and the marginalized and so on, which are actually good assumptions. They've just got slightly out of balance in certain cases, and it's led to some changes that you find challenging, and that we spend a lot of our lives trying to help people handle. But a lot of them have Christian roots, and I just think talking through those things again is not to say no problem here, guys. Of course, you still got to live in this world, but I think it does help us love our neighbors better. I think it helps us understand why they think the way they do, and even to see some of it as being an outgrowth of things that we cherish very dearly, and they might in places see more clearly than we do. And I think that's so yes, in that sense it's self-reflection, but not just about what have I got wrong, but what has the world got right, or why does the world think the way it does. It may well be having grown out of things that are very dear to me.
That's fascinating. Wow. All right, final question. I always love to ask people outside of the US context this question, and it's funny, I think my podcast is more popular in the UK than in the US. Not
maybe like because you ask all of these questions about why the American Revolution disobeyed Romans 13.
where I was going with that is I almost said, for our American audience, but I'm like, no, actually my audience is, I mean, the numbers are definitely higher because population size, but percentage wise are I think per capita, my podcast is higher ranked in your homeland than mine. But um, as somebody outside the U.S. context, can you help pastor us as you look on from the outside to American Christianity? I know it's a huge concept, huge movement, filled with tons of diversity. But and you can take it any direction you want to go. But if you were like on your dying on your pastoral bed, and American Christians were like, can you give us some words of wisdom as we are navigating, an upcoming election season, and just the integration of politics and Christianity is not totally unique to the U.S. context, but it has a uniqueness that I
Yeah.
think sometimes us fish swimming in water can't really understand what water looks like, So, yeah. Anywhere you want to go with that is our sort of
Yeah,
final thoughts here on this conversation.
it's a generous question, and it's one because I get asked this quite a lot because of lots of friends in America and traveling there. I feel less confident answering it every time I get asked it because I'm aware of how deep some of the differences are between America and not just Britain and many other post-Christian countries. I think something I think is true, which can help. I think is that you guys or the American church is experiencing a loss of prestige and
Mm,
adherence that in about 7 years that took about 70 in Western Europe. So
mm,
you are experiencing something that has happened elsewhere in the world. You're just experiencing it much more quickly,
mm,
and that is more painful in a strange way, which is in some ways good because it means that there is something precious is being lost, which in Europe people just gradually went, that famous line, I no longer, it's just the long melancholy withdrawing roar of Christianity. Way back in the 19th century, people were saying that, and whereas in America, it's like, no, there's a proper apocalypse about it in a lot of circles.
huh,
But I do think that to see them as being analogous, but that one of them is just happening much faster, can help people because they'd say, firstly, there is a future for a church that is much more marginal in the society than it was, and the fact that Christian values not being held in the public square, and obviously we've given lots of examples, by the way, of when they never have been on
yeah.
race and slavery and many others. So let's take that for read. But even now, that if you see certain Christian convictions being pushed to the margins of the public square, that doesn't necessarily mean that the church doesn't have a future of being able to shine as a light, and there are some benefits to it, because there can be a winnowing, I guess, a purifying of the church. I don't mean the church in Britain is more pure than it is in America. I'm not saying that, but I think that certainly you're much less. It's true in the States already. Let's say that you are much less likely to go to church if you don't believe a word of it if you live in San Francisco than you are if you live in Montgomery or whatever. Like, there are lots of examples like that. And in Britain, that's obviously writ large, and in Europe it is. And that there can be the encouragement is there can be some benefits to that. But I think obviously the challenge is that it is also painful, and it's happening at a rate which makes people feel discombobulated, which is partly what I'm trying to help with this book. Um,
Mm,
but also just a real sense of, it can tip into, as it often does, anger and resentment. And I think that's where pastorally, we just have to help the people of God say, look, providence, God, the big 18th century themes, God is in charge over all things.
mm,
He knew this was going to happen. It has happened to countries before, countries who were profoundly Christian, it would seem, from top to bottom, particularly in the rise of Islam, of course, when the church got completely overturned. And then 1,000 years later, you'd see there's almost no Christians left. And even within 100 years, there were not many left. And the church has survived, and the church has
mm,
bedded in, and winter has turned to spring and will once again turn to summer. That long view of what happens in other
yeah.
nations can be an encouragement to us, but that doesn't take away from the pain of it. And a lot of the time, I don't think I know what I would do were I a pastor in America, because I actually
Mm,
think now, as opposed to 20 years ago, I thought it's easier to be a pastor in America than in Britain. But now I definitely don't think that. I think it's
uh,
harder because the issues people in the church are facing are more complex and demanding than they are in my church, I think, in many cases.
yeah. That's good. That's good. I would love. I think this is true. I mean, I'll throw it out there and people can kind of chew on it. But losing cultural as Christians, when we lose cultural power, we should not equate that to losing gospel influence. In fact, I would probably say that when we had cultural power, that actually stunted our actual gospel witness. I don't think Christianity was designed to have cultural power. The entire Bible was written by people and for people that did not have cultural power. And I know that even the word power we need to define and so on. But
I think that's seen at the end of John 6 when the disciples are the only ones left, and they've all gone. They've all been offended by what Jesus said. And he said, are you leaving too? And they're like, where else are we going to go? You've got the words of life. I think something of that has been happening to the Western church over 100 years, but I think it's probably happening quite quickly in the States. And
I never thought about that.
That for the good of the church.
I never thought about it in those terms, that what many other Christians have experienced in their country, it just happened more slowly, where for whatever reason it's happened so quickly here, and it has caused a kind of disorienting among Christians. I just, so many. Well, I just open up more questions in my mind, but I've taken you over an hour, Andrew. Man, I'm excited to continue to read this book. It's again very well written too. I mean, you're a good writer, so shouldn't be surprising. It's just when you pull together just so much from history in a way that and you make it exciting and easy to read and hard to put down and also very relevant. So anyway, I'm super excited to continue reading this book. So appreciate you, man.
Oh, that's really kind of you. It's great talking about it. I so appreciate the time.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.